Nombulelo Shange, lecturer and chairperson of the University of Free State's Women Forum, has written an opinion piece titled "How Black Women in Top Academic Posts Are Demeaned." She argues that if black men have faced the worst of fates, then black women have also placed their lives and bodies on the line. Black women have stood by black men, marched with them, and nurtured and guided them, only to be rejected and oppressed by them. She has mentioned attacks on University of Cape Town's Vice-Chancellor, Professor Abula, and UNISA's first black woman leader, Professor Abula. Nombulelo joins us now via video link from Bloemfontein. Shange, thank you very much for availing yourself this afternoon. I'd like for us perhaps to start with some of the achievements and the excellence that you highlight on the part of the three women that you cited in your opinion piece. You want them to be remembered as important symbols and change makers. Who are they?
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me on the show, and good afternoon to your viewers. So it's definitely very important to acknowledge the achievements of black women within higher education, particularly when they rise to levels of top management. That in and of itself is a huge stride, considering the difficulties often placed either through bureaucratic structures or through systems that are just unwilling to change, in front of minorities, in front of especially various gender groups. So as a black female, if you're able to actually meet those strides and actually make it into top management, that in and of itself is a huge accomplishment. Never mind the fact that then these women have actually continued to push the bar and ensure that these institutions are institutions that can be competitive within the continent as well as internationally.
In spite of this, they continue to face, you argue, sexual objectification, with people saying they're menopausing, and they get insults about how they are slay queens. And you cite in particular black men who are perpetuating this. What do we need to understand about the dynamics faced by black women in academia?
I mean, academia has so many metaphorical, physical representations of patriarchy, from even the phallic structures that exist in terms of the metaphorical, to even the fact that the higher and higher you go up in the rankings, the less and less you start to see women, and black women in particular. Often when this type of attack comes from black men, it carries a lot more weight and a lot more hurt, partly because of our shared history of oppression, and as I articulate in the opinion piece, partly because in that shared history of oppression, it's often been black women who put themselves in the front lines to ensure that the rights of black men who are being repressed, be it in the family, in the community, are actually being met, are actually being protected. And so when we find ourselves in spaces where finally, almost for the first time really, as black women, we are starting to enter certain spaces within corporate, within higher education, and we start to move up the ranks, and we find that it's people who really should be our allies that are often the ones who are responsible for perpetuating some of the marginalization. It's not to say that black men create the system, because the system has existed far beyond them. It's existed in some instances for over a century, especially if you're looking at higher education. It's existed in the country for over 300 years. So the frustration and the concern is often that black men don't see that the pain and the marginalization that they've been put under by these same systems is the same type of pain they use to marginalize black women, to disregard them, to question their leadership when, in instances when they make it into leadership positions.
Somebody could very well argue to say, well, these are quote-unquote educated men. Does this then suggest that it's got nothing to do with the level of education that you have, but as you've noted, something that is deeply seated within, some sectors of our society? If so, How then do we turn the tide? And also, can we continue to have these conversations without these men?
So as educated as they are, as educated as we might be, unfortunately, we all carry the patriarchy. We all carry the racial inferiority at times as well, because these are systematic things that have been done over, again, a span of decades, centuries in some instances. So it's often difficult, and I think this is where I do empathize with Black men. It is difficult to sort of interrogate the patriarchy within yourself and to identify it as patriarchy, toxic masculinity, rather than you are engaging a leader on an issue that you feel like this leader needs to actually sort of address. There's different ways of challenging people without dragging in their gender or their race into the discourse. And unfortunately, Black men aren't interrogating that enough, especially when they themselves rise into positions of hierarchy, into positions of power. I think there's also a bit of a crisis that is taking place, not just in academia, but across various spaces. There's often this notion or this belief that Black women are coming in as a threat, that we're only there because of BEE criteria and not because we're capable and qualified. And often men, and Black men in particular, find that to be a sort of threat to their own positionality in those spaces, a threat to the fact that they might have had to deal with years or decades before the sort of more gradual emergence of Black women into various spaces.
You cite Professor Link Abula and her stalwart colleagues at UNISA having kept the academic ship sailing. She's captained the institution to winning the Excellence for Research Impact Award at the 2022 Zaire International Awards, which were hosted in Dubai. Tell us maybe why, her issue really touched your heart.
Well, she was a part of UFS previously, and before moving to UNISA. So there were moments where we got to interface. I've engaged with some of her scholarly work. I believe in her politics, and I believe in her leadership. Her politics is very much around issues around equity, including for women, people of color, as well as ensuring that there's harmony in different spaces that we find ourselves in, particularly higher learning. She writes even quite extensively about ecological injustice and issues around climate change, which are often not given the kind of attention that they should be given. And in a lot of ways, she was writing about this discourse a few decades ago, before it was even commonplace. Nowadays, you might find a little bit more discourse on these issues. So I see her as an important scholar in that regard. And I think her and other women like her within higher education need to be given celebrated for the achievements that they've had, rather than just being treated as if they are there just as tick boxes or just as BE categorizations. They've actually contributed a lot to the academy. They continue to contribute a lot to society as well, and we really need to celebrate that.
As recent as 3.5 years ago, a very important man in my life, an elderly man, asked me, what is patriarchy? What are we talking about? And so again, maybe in involving or putting men at this table when we talk about these issues and trying to come up with solutions, or at least to sensitize them, how important is that, and where do we begin with that conversation?
So it's important to recognize that patriarchy is an even older system than racism. Patriarchy is over 2,000 years old, but then there's interlinkages between the two systems. So we have to be very careful when we ignore certain patriarchal norms, because they create the breeding ground for racial discrimination. They create the breeding ground for almost every injustice that we see in society. And I think men as well are not having enough of the discussion to say that patriarchy actually in a lot of ways hurts them more than it hurts women. So patriarchy in their instance is the fact that black men in particular are filling most of the jails and prison cells that we have in society, because society has this fear of black masculinity and the black physical body in the male form. And that is one way that the system deals with black men and punishes them for their patriarchy. There's many other examples, but yes, it's definitely important for men themselves to start leading this conversation, because feminists have already been doing it arguably for decades, if not centuries as well. So men really need to start positioning themselves in this discussion and interrogating how patriarchy hurts them and how they embody the patriarchal pains that they actually transfer onto women, be it in the family or in the workplace or wherever we find ourselves.
Mashange Siyabonga. Nombulelo Shange is a lecturer and chairperson of the University of Free State's Women Forum.